It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Robert Jenrick, Labour MP Carolyn Harris, Miatta Fahnbulleh, Chief Executive of the Left of Centre think tank the New Economics Foundation, and Conservative councillor and former government advisor Anita Boateng. Today, what does the Chancellor's budget mean for all of us?
We funded public services, we're investing in our future growth. My priority is to be able to cut taxes for people.
For all the Chancellor's upbeat delivery, the voters may not get much feel-good factor.
The row between Britain and France over fishing heats up. A British boat is detained in French waters.
History shows that this House and our great nation's interests are best served by standing up to the threats of little Napoleons clinging on to power.
Also today, do we need to change our behaviour to tackle climate change?
I cycle to work. I have reduced my meat consumption. I don't fly as much as I used to.
It was really debilitating. Sometimes it was really difficult to go to work with those symptoms.
Dealing with the menopause, should HRT drugs be available free in England? Let's start with the budget and the spending review. It was a big day in Westminster yesterday. It continues to be so as all the analysis is taken in. Let's have a look at a couple of the papers and how they are covering it, starting with the Daily Mail. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson there. The drinks are on us. A £150 billion spree sends spending to highest in decades. If we go to the next paper headline, The Guardian, Sunak's post-COVID plan, spend now, cut taxes later. And finally, the Daily Telegraph. Hey, big spenders, the two of them. Bit of Shirley Bassey for those who remember that song. If we listen to what the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said, they have said that tax rises and inflation will result in falling living standards for many and real pain for low-income households. Robert, how does that stack with the new age of optimism?
Well, I think if you take a step back, what the Chancellor was able to say yesterday, which was a cause for real optimism, is that the economy and the country is in, frankly, a much better state than anyone would have imagined just a few months ago. Certainly the last time that he was able to make a statement, the last time that the independent OBR published its forecasts. Unemployment is much lower than expected. 2 million more people are in work than was forecast last time. The economy is growing. Tax revenues are rising. And that gave the Chancellor some bandwidth to make some decisions. Now, he's chosen to do two things. Firstly, to save a bit in reserve because of the concern about inflation and continued economic uncertainty. But secondly, to help the cost of living by making that big change to the way that universal credit's taper is arranged to help around 2 million people who are in work but on lower and modest incomes. And then secondly, to back public services and ensure that as we go forward for the rest of this Parliament, every government department, most of our big public services, by recent standards, are well funded.
Right, well, that's why there is reason for optimism, a real terms rise for every single Whitehall department.
Well, there's not much optimism in my constituency because Robert talks about a third of the people who are affected by the tax credits cut. 6 million people are affected. Only 1.9 million are going to benefit from yesterday. And what we know today is that 2006-2007, the average tax bill is going to be £3,000 more than when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. That's not an optimistic view for my constituents who are already struggling on tight budgets.
Right, Anita, also, the IFS have said that middle earners are likely to be worse off next year as high rates of inflation and tax rises eat into their incomes.
Yes, and I think there are some concerns from the Treasury about inflation, but I think, there is some reassurance that what they expect to happen, the OBR, is for inflation to peak sort of middle of next year and for it to fall. But certainly, I think that the Chancellor had some tough decisions to make at this budget. And I think what he prioritised, which was, as Robert says, the tax cut for universal credit recipients, which is incredibly useful for those lower earners, and then also investment in some of those key departments that are struggling at the moment. So, for instance, we saw a kind of £150 billion go into departments over the course of this Parliament, which will make a tremendous difference to DfE, to justice, where the court's backlog is rising. So I think we saw some real kind of a down payment in some of the things that I think that people who will be voting and looking to vote Conservative again in 2023, 2024 are really want to see.
Do you share this optimism, Jette?
Well, look, the good news was that the Chancellor did increase spending in public services and I think has put to bed the folly of 10 years of austerity. But the increases that we're going to see only accounts for about a third of the cuts that we've seen. I think the bad news is, if you look at the government's watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's telling us that wages are going to be on a downward spiral, that living standards will not have budged for nearly 20 years, the majority of which this government has presided over the economy, which is an absolute indictment. And if I was the Chancellor, I would have done far more to deal with that problem. What he did for lower income earners, the changes in the taper rate, the increases in the national living wage are all good things. But they're completely offset by the cut to the £20 uplift. So 3/4 of the people that are on universal credit are going to be worse off after the budget measures, which makes absolutely no sense. So if his priority was cost of living, he didn't do enough.
Right. What do you say in response, particularly on this reduction in the taper rate on universal credit?
Well, I think that's a really important step forward, actually, because
it doesn't mitigate the removal of the £20 a week.
Well, the £20 a week was an emergency measure taken at the height of the pandemic, and most countries around the world have seen those measures as temporary, things that have eventually to be retired. The change to universal credit is a permanent change, and that rewards work, so that somebody out there listening to this programme today, thinking about maybe taking on a couple more hours, knows that they're going to be keeping 8% more of their take-home pay for those extra hours worked than they would have been before the budget. That's a big step forward. But I would just say that the Resolution Foundation has published some analysis today which shows that it's actually those lower-income households who are going to be benefiting from this budget, not the higher end of the spectrum. They will be paying more as a result of, as you say, some of the tax rises like national insurance in particular. But the fuel duty cut, the alcohol changes, the universal credit taper change, that really helps those bottom quartile households, the people that we should all care about, because we care about tackling inequality.
But Robert, a lot of countries are not stripping away the support that they're providing, partly because we're not out of the woods yet. And at the end of the day, it was a political choice to get rid of the £20 uplift, which, by the way, only accounts for a third of the cuts that we've seen in welfare since 2010. And so, my big issue is that you say you're trying to help people. There were 3 million people who are going to be suffering from the combination of that £20 uplift cut plus higher price rises, and there was absolutely nothing in the budget for them.
That's not exactly true, is it? Because there's the universal credit changes, there's the lifting of the pay freeze for public sector workers, so people in the public sector on lower incomes will be able to, and then obviously there's the increase in the national living wage.
3 million people not in work that are going to be hit by that £20 uplift at the same time as we're seeing skyrocketing prices following a pandemic where everyone is struggling. There was absolutely nothing in that budget.
Well, it's not the case.
And
there's
that was
nothing,
a question
there's
of
nothing
choices and priorities
in the budget. But I do think you're right on two fronts. One is that we should be concerned about inflation, and I think the Chancellor was right to show that that's actually going to last for quite a long time. I think it'll be with us
for the whole of next year, average of 4%.
I think that it will be with us for the whole of next year. If you look at the problems you're seeing, I mean, the debate is very similar in the United States, for example. Rising cost of consumer goods, rising cost of energy prices, difficulty with labour shortages. So it's not unique to the UK. It's happening in most parts of the world. I don't think it's going to pass quickly. I think the Bank of England was wrong when just a few months ago was saying this was transitory. It's going to be something that we need to worry about.
Yeah, but what did the Chancellor mean when he says that he's reminded the Bank of England, he's written to them to say that they should still adhere to their remit of low inflation? How will they do that?
Well, there's only two principal levers at their disposal. One is to increase interest rates, and that is something that they will need to do, I think, over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But it will have a big impact on many households, particularly obviously homeowners, and those people haven't really had an interest rate rise of any size for a long time, so that will be a big shock to many households. They could also pull back on quantitative easing. They've been pumping money into the economy, driving demand, and I think that's probably gone too far. So they'll be thinking through what their response needs to be on both of those fronts.
It's really important that we unpick what's driving inflation. It's not because the economy is overheating. So it's not a question of demand. It's not a question of spending. It's not a question of investment. It's due to bottlenecks. It's due to energy prices. Those are the things that are driving it. It's on the supply side. And actually, the worst thing that the Bank of England can do is increase interest rates, because what does that do? That stops investment that's going to unlock the very bottlenecks that you need to unplug. So the reason why the bank hasn't intervened so far is because they're looking at it and they're like, well, this is a supply side problem. It's not the economy overheating. The risk now is actually we see inflation. And if the government decides to stop any of its investment and pump priming the economy, you see GDP falling. And
I think you're right that the economy is in a more fragile position than many people imagine. Just because everybody's going out and spending in the shops and there's an optimistic vibe at the moment doesn't mean that we should be complacent. I think it could peter out. And the point actually you made earlier, I think, was the most important one, which is that if you look at the OBR's forecasts, they're suggesting this year and next year will have quite strong growth, but thereafter it will turn back to really quite low growth.
All right,
as low as 1.3%. So what everyone needs to be thinking about now is how do you grow the economy? How do you raise productivity? And there were measures in the budget like that. For example, the infrastructure investment, the focus on skills.
Hang on, Robert.
That's what we should really all be
All right, I want to bring the others in, Anita, because one of the other striking parts of the budget is that taking both yesterday's and the March budgets together, this year the Chancellor has raised taxes by more than has happened in any single year since 1993. Is that something you welcome?
Yes, and that was an extraordinary moment too in 1993 when we had Norman Lamont and Ken Clarke increasing taxes in two budgets after Black Wednesday. And I think that this Chancellor made it very clear at the end of the speech that that is not what he wanted to do. The reality is it gave him a lot of wiggle room in this budget, both to bank some of those decreases to borrowing in the future, but also to give to departments. And I think that really the challenge at the moment and what we're seeing from this Chancellor is kind of saying, I'm going to be a man of my word, hold me to the commitments I'm making in this speech around tax cuts. And I think that he will make good on those promises in the coming years.
Well, we'll obviously have to see about that. Carolyn, there have been comparisons with Gordon Brown, that he would have been proud of this budget. High spending, high taxation. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with anything that's in the budget because, like I've said...
Nothing at all?
No, because I just think that my constituents are already struggling. They can't afford to pay the electricity bill. They're struggling to put food on the table, and there was nothing in that budget yesterday which is going to make them feel...
What about the increases to the national living wage and the minimum wage? Are you saying you don't support those?
Well... we don't know what the maths behind it are yet. I mean, yeah, OK...
Well, we know what the increases are going to be. Do you support the principle of it?
The principle, yes, but we've got to make sure that the unions are working with the companies and the unions that have a say in this, because obviously they are instrumental to making sure that the workforces are actually provided for adequately.
Right. Are you comfortable with those sorts of rises? Wages rising, of course, is fuelling inflation, isn't it? I mean, Boris Johnson literally has said to people, go to your boss, ask them for a 4% rise. Is that something that you will be encouraging people to do?
I'm concerned about inflation, obviously. I think that's the big issue. I think that the national living wage has been a success. It does, in the long run, drive productivity. It encourages employers to treat their employees better. So I support that. It will lead to higher wages, real terms increases in wages for workers, because even if the OBR is correct and inflation is around 4%, this is a 6.6% increase. So I think that's a good step forward. I am concerned about the levels of public spending and taxation that we're seeing. They are very high by historic standards, and it's very difficult for an economy to sustain those for any length of time.
Would you have liked Rishi Sunak to make different decisions yesterday?
Well, I think he's been driven by, obviously, the exceptional circumstances of the pandemic.
But would you have liked to have seen a different priority?
Well, I think I would be more cautious than I think the government currently is about increasing taxation and increasing the burden of taxation, because it's now at the highest level that we've seen in peacetime. But I think that the two factors that obviously weigh on the government's mind are, firstly, the fact that we've just come out of an extraordinary pandemic that's led to £400 billion of spending. These are very unusual circumstances. And then secondly, that just sheer demographics and public interest and concern for the NHS and social care are driving the need to spend very large amounts of money. 40% of current spending is now on the NHS. And I don't think there are that many people out there who would disagree with that, because they want to see a well-funded NHS. They want to see the backlogs cleared.
Yeah.
But that is having serious consequences for the amount of public spending that we're seeing.
So I think we've got to take a step back, because actually when you look at the tax bill, yes, it's high historically, but if you compare us to other countries in Northern Europe, for example, it's still quite low. We're on par with Germany. Countries like Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway pay far more in tax than we do. And for me, I think if people feel that the taxes are going to stuff that makes their lives better, public services that we care about, that enrich our communities, they'll be fine to pay that tax. It's when they think the government's wasting the money that it's a problem. But for me, the key question is not the tax burden, but who is bearing the load of that tax. And if you look at the national insurance rise, if you look at council tax, it is disproportionately hitting lower income households. Why on earth the government isn't, for example, looking to equalise the tax on wealth in order to raise up some of the money that we need for the NHS? I do not know. We've got to get the tax burden as fair as we can.
All right, let's move on to something slightly different but connected, because one of the announcements was a levy on property developers yesterday. Robert, you are the former Housing and Community Secretary. The tax is expected to raise £2 billion over 10 years, which will be used to remove unsafe cladding on high-rise buildings, and it will also be part of a £5 billion fund which the government due to put up the rest. Let's just show you this, though, reaction from End Our Cladding Scandal. This £2 billion developer tax spread over 10 years may sound like a lot until you realise that the estimates to fix this crisis could be between 15 and £50 billion. Ultimately, it'll be homeowners who'll be left to pick up the can. Is that fair?
Well, look, when I arrived as Housing Secretary 2.5 years ago, I inherited £600 million that my predecessor, the late James Brokenshire, had to fight unbelievably hard to secure from the then Chancellor, Philip Hammond.
Why aren't the property developers
I then
picking up
secured £5 billion. It is a difficult challenge. Michael Gove is the new secretary. It's very difficult, we've found historically, to persuade the Treasury to give the money so that the works can be paid for up front by the state, and then the money secured, if possible, from the developers.
But who's best able to afford to pay for this to happen? Is it property developers through taxation or homeowners?
Well, it's obviously a mixture of the two, isn't it? There are individuals out there at the moment who are receiving bills which they simply can't afford to pay, and that's a very difficult situation. What the government has said at the moment is that it will pay for the removal of all the unsafe cladding on the high-rise buildings.
And what about the ones below?
Below, it was saying, I don't know exactly what Michael Gove will choose to do, but previously, because the government, the Treasury, weren't willing to give us the grant funding to do it, we said we'd do it via loans to those individuals. It is worth just saying that for the lower-rise buildings, in most cases, works shouldn't be necessary. And at the moment, we're seeing a really risk-averse culture, which is driving costs.
All right, Carolyn?
The homeowners just
it's
shouldn't
not
be
new
paying.
money for a start. This was money that was announced previously, and since February, when £5 billion was promised to the leaseholders, they've not received a penny of it. And until this until this government is ready to put in the appropriate legislation, which is to protect leaseholders and to make sure that health and safety assessments are governed and controlled, then we're not going to see this problem go away. And you know, when we see social housing foundations and associations actually invest in so much money into making sure their properties are safe, we're going to see less affordable homes being built, because they're going to be better standard of safety, but they're going to be too expensive. I mean, so we've got to do something to change
the choice
this.
For the government, I'm obviously able to speak a bit more freely now than I was just a few months ago. The choice for the government is, what is the balance between the state paying and then trying to recoup as much of that as possible from the developers through taxes and the leaseholder? At the moment, the balance is £5 billion by the state. The remainder, we don't know exactly how much that will be, but clearly multiple billion pounds being paid by the leaseholders. The leaseholders obviously find that extremely unfair, but the only way to fix that would be for the taxpayer to step in and massively increase that £5 billion fund. At the moment, and I fought this battle for a couple of years, the Treasury, the government is simply not willing to do that.
I think where you have homeowners who, through no fault of their own, are looking at bills of up to £100,000 to fix this problem, which is not a problem that they created, it's deeply unfair to expect them to foot that bill. I think that actually the levy on developers is a good thing, but why are we only raising £2 billion over 10 years? Why are we not raising more? So, if we're looking at anything up to 50 billion, the Select Committee says it's probably about 15 billion. Why are we not trying to cover that 15 billion by getting developers to foot more of the bill, because this is partly their fault, and then, yes, taxpayers footing the others? Is far fairer than someone who is looking at a 100,000 bill and has no idea where that money's going to come from.
Very briefly to respond.
Well, I think you probably could levy more from the developers. It is complicated because actually the developers' tax is primarily a tax on developers who didn't build these types of buildings. Now, you may not have much sympathy with extremely profitable volume house builders.
Well, that's the point.
But many of them actually weren't the ones who built these buildings because they build, homes rather than high-rise buildings. But I think that is the only avenue available if the government wants to secure more money without simply putting it on the taxpayer.
We're going to move on and talk about the ongoing standoff between British and French maritime authorities over fishing licences and fishing rights. A British trawler has been detained by French maritime police without a licence, say the French, in French waters. And this follows what Paris considers to be Britain's failure to honour its commitments on fishing rights following the UK leaving the EU. Let's see these pictures here of French trawlers. This is actually from May. They were protesting outside the port of St Helier in Jersey over a previous decision from the UK and Jersey to deny fishing licences to French boats. Now, there's been an urgent question in the House of Commons, answered by George Eustace, who has called for calm, the Environment Secretary. But you heard in the headlines one of the responses and contributions to the debate from Tory MP Andrew Bridgen, saying that the UK government needed to stand up to Emmanuel Macron behaving like a little Napoleon. Is that going to help calm matters, Anita?
Absolutely not. And I rather think that there's something about, the kind of row that you might have with a friend that's much more heated than you might have with a potential enemy. And it feels to me as though the French are rather enjoying ratcheting up some of the rhetoric around this, and in particular using this as a message and a signal of the kinds of robust actions that they want to send. And part of this will be about, politics in France and the general election, or the election next year. But all of that, an additional disruption is nevertheless not going to persuade the British to be much more amenable to the French moving forward. Right.
What do you think the way forward is, Carolyn? Are the French ratcheting it up, as Anita says?
Well, I think that we've seen this kind of tactic before from the French fishermen and the French government. We're in a very vulnerable position. I think that there were promises made to our fishing industry which haven't been fulfilled, and I think the government really has to do more to protect them and make sure that their rights to fish are well and truly covered.
Right. Is Emmanuel Macron a little Napoleon?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that in the lead up to a French presidential election, you see stunts like this happening. I have no idea whether it has anything to do with Emmanuel Macron himself, but it's it's one in a long line of flare-ups like this. So it seems childish to me. This fishing vessel shouldn't have been detained. This needs to be sorted out in a sensible, grown-up manner. And we should be holding our ground. We're an independent coastal state. That was one of the things we wanted to achieve as a result of Brexit, and that means that discussions between ourselves and France or any other nation are done in a sensible, mature way.
Right. Miata?
Well, look, whether the French are overreacting or not, I don't think either side has been doing particularly well. And I think, quite frankly, our government has essentially reneged on a set of commitments we made in that Brexit deal. And at the heart of this, the Prime Minister told us he'd got Brexit done. He told us he'd got it done and it would be good for us, good for our fishers, good for the country. And actually what this shows that he hasn't got it done. And there are still issues. He either signed that deal not having a clue what he was signing, best case scenario, or he deliberately signed it and then is reneging on it, worst case scenario. Either way, it is his problem. The buck stops with him and he's got to fix it. All of this is noise, but at the heart of it is a deal that we've messed up, that we signed, and it's now coming back to bite the Prime Minister, and it is his problem.
Well, I think this actually shows that Brexit achieved, in this one respect, what it set out to do. We do control our own waters. we are now in a position where France wants more licences to fish in our coastal waters, it has to come and negotiate. It's very unfortunate they're doing it in this, as I say, childish manner.
Robert,
but it's a world away from what it would have been had we remained within the European Union, where we wouldn't be in this position at all.
Robert, at the risk of potentially triggering a trade war, the EU is our biggest trading partner. Exports to the EU this year were down by about 1.7 billion on pre-pandemic. The impact on the economy will be huge. And at the end of the day, that Brexit deal was about making people's lives better. This matters because if we disrupt trade with our biggest trading partner on our block, it will impact on the economy. The Office for Budget Responsibility this week said the impact of Brexit long-term on the economy was far worse than the pandemic. 4% below where we would have been otherwise. So for me, it matters because the whole premise of Brexit was to make the economy better, was to make our lives better. So irrespective of whose fault it is, the government's got to fix it, and it's got to fix it so it works for all of us.
I don't think you should be defending the actions of France, which don't seem like sensible ways to resolve a dispute.
Actions. I'm saying
no one is suggesting
ridiculous.
that we want to have a trade war with our closest and largest trading partner. But you are right to highlight that one of the things we saw yesterday from the OBR's figures is that the trade numbers for the country are poor. And whilst we've had huge success over the course of last year in signing up new trade deals with other countries around the world, long may that continue.
So has it been a price worth paying?
We do have an issue with our exporters, and I think that should now be one of the things the government focuses on, because that's going to hurt the economy in the long term if we can't fix that.
Let's move on and talk about the climate, because as everybody knows, unless you've been living under a rock, we have got this climate summit coming up in Glasgow. I think we can show you the front page of The Spectator, which has something related to this, and if not, oh no, there it is, cop out, Boris's battle to save the climate summit. Let's talk to our climate editor, Justin Rolat. Justin, welcome to you. Explain what COP26 actually is and what's being discussed.
Oh, modest question.
Absolutely. You've got 30 seconds. No, I'm joking.
Okay, I'll wrap it up very quickly. It's a process. So a process set in place when the world came together at Rio for the Earth Summit in 1992, way back when, and agreed that there was this issue with global warming and maybe they should get together to do something about it. What shall we do? We can't decide what's fair, who should do what. So they set in process this series of conferences to the conferences of the parties to that original agreement, and those have rolled out over the last 27 years, because we missed one. But and that's why we've got to COP26. So this is a process of the world coming together, trying to agree who's going to do what to cut carbon emissions, essentially, at its most simple. Is that good enough for you, Joe?
Yes, that has satisfied me, certainly. I don't know about the rest of the panel. What will success look like, then?
What will the
success then actually look like, do you think?
Success is actually, look, in my mind, success is really simple. This is all about cutting greenhouse gas emissions, principally carbon dioxide, so we should be looking at whether it is making real cuts now to carbon dioxide emissions. We already have the answer in, because countries are supposed to give their commitments in terms of carbon cuts before the meeting, and at the moment, the latest from the UN is that we are heading for a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees. Carbon emissions are predicted to continue to increase rather than decreasing by 45% by 2030, which is what the UN science says has to happen if we're going to stay within safe temperature. Well, not safe limits. We're going to avoid the worst of global warming and stay around 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Now, what do you say to people who would point to the fact that whatever we do here will be dwarfed by the ongoing polluters of China, India and the US?
You lead by example, you say. You say, you know, we had the first industrial revolution here in Britain. It's what Boris Johnson says. We had the first industrial revolution. We began putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in huge quantities before anyone else. We need to take responsibility and lead. We're part of the rich world, and we need to use some of the money that we made from burning all that ready energy of fossil fuels to invest in the transition and show the rest of the world how it's done and that it can be done profitably. And I think there's a really strong argument that you can build, you know, that we could be the epicenter of a new industrial revolution. I've described it before, you know, building wind turbines in the North Sea, developing solar, new nuclear, for example, are all opportunities for Britain to reach out into the world and say, look, here are products and services that we can offer as part of this vast transition. Do not underestimate how massive this is. It's 84% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. We're becoming an ever more energy-intensive world. The transition we need to make quite literally, you know, and there's a lot of hyperbole on your programme, Joe, but I'm going to say this is the biggest biggest challenge the world has ever faced.
All right, well, that is a good point to end. Justin Rowlatt, thank you very much. Justin also talked about leading by example. Well, the Chief Scientific Advisor was asked about behavioural changes. Sir Patrick Vallance, let's listen to him.
We can all do that may seem tiny individually, but you aggregate them across millions and it makes a difference. So, I can tell you what I do. I cycle to work. I have reduced my meat consumption. I don't fly as much as I used to. Doesn't mean I've stopped meat consumption, doesn't mean I'm never going to fly again. I am going to, but I'm going to reduce those things. And I think those aggregate actions across millions make a difference as well.
Carolyn, are you going to change your behaviour anytime soon?
Well, I'm certainly not going to stop eating steak. It's the only pleasure a menopausal woman has sometimes.
I like the way you've joined those two subjects. What about you, Anita? Are you going to change your behaviour in terms of the environment?
I don't really know anyone that hasn't, whether that's about kind of being more conscious about travel or meat
being
consumption.
more conscious about travel, but have you actually flown? Will you be flying less, I should say, in the future because we've had the pandemic?
I think so, and I think most people are looking for alternatives. And I think that really, if you're interested in answering the question of what more can you do, if you want to do more, there are definitely options available now. And we have a UK society, thankfully, where there's enough structure in place. If you want to reduce meat consumption, cycle more, that's all possible. But really what we should be looking to is that kind of broader structural change. And that's where business really matters in delivering the kind of innovation that we need to see to allow us to do things like make our homes more efficient or to use cars more efficiently. And that's where the real prizes are.
Right. I mean, do you think there's been an honest enough conversation with people? And do you think it is necessary to change our behaviour, eat less meat, fly less in order to reach or help reach net zero?
So I don't think we've had an honest conversation. I think there is going to have to be some behavioural change, but I think there's only so much that individuals can do without being helped. And, Anita talked about the role of business. There's a really important role for business, but there's also a fundamental role for government in regulation, in legislation, and critically in investment, which is why, by the way, not to go back to the budget, it was breathtaking that the Chancellor did not mention climate once in his speech. In the end, we're going to need systemic change, and that requires government, £30 billion of investment in order to help that green transition is what we need a year. The government has committed £7 billion, and I think that speaks for itself.
Have you changed your behaviour? Are you going to?
Well, I'm not going to cut down on steak because I share Carolyn's passion for a good steak. But I am thinking about it. I'm actually getting a heat pump fitted at home actually in the coming months. So I think we're all much more aware. There's a lot more we all, frankly, I certainly could do to change my behaviour. I don't think it's actually helpful for the state to go around telling people what to do on these things like stopping eating meat. I think educating people, raising awareness is important, but it will be counterproductive to all of our ambitions to tackle climate change if we start nannying people too much.
Well, let's go back to that honest conversation. Let's show you this statement from Boris Johnson in the government net zero strategy. For years, going green was inextricably bound up with the sense that we have to sacrifice the things we love. But this strategy shows how we can build back greener without so much as a hair shirt in sight. Miata?
So I think he's being relatively he's being Boris. Let me put it like that. In the end, there are going to have to be changes. I think most people recognise this. I think the question for me is how do we do this transition? And actually, I'm really optimistic about the transition because on the other side of it, if we get it right, is a world that is safer, but it, should mean more jobs. It should mean lifting up living standards. It should mean, warmer, cleaner homes. There are some upsides to this, but it's not going to happen by accident. Right? It requires all of us to do our part, but it also requires businesses and government to do their part.
Right.
That's how we do the transition.
Anita, is this Boris Johnson and cakeism? Having his cake and eating it?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the Net Zero Review was the most comprehensive one of these that really exists in any country. And the UK has been leading the way for a long time in its thinking and its innovation and its investment in green. And I think that that is a positive for our country. That's not to say that the Net Zero Review didn't spell out some of the difficult choices, particularly around homes and heating that will face our country. But ultimately, there are advantages to getting ahead of this, not least in the number of ways in which we'll be able to sell our innovations abroad.
Right. I mean, in terms of investment, though, £28 billion has been committed by Labour, if it were in government, in terms of investing in the green economy. Nothing like that from the government.
Well, we're already investing billions of pounds in the transition. We're
7 billion a year. As opposed to the 30 billion.
£7 billion a year is a lot of money. I mean, I
We've
know
got
that
10
the
years.
pandemic has skewed everybody's
We've got 10
understanding
years
of what
to
is
make this-
money, but £7 billion is a lot of money. We're also doing this through smart changes to regulation, which doesn't cost the state necessarily so much, like, for example, the phasing out of gas boilers, the phasing out of diesel and petrol cars. These things will ensure that the private sector ramps up over a period of time, brings down the price of those new products, and hopefully we will all be able to take them up when the time comes.
I'd just say you cannot do the transition to net zero on the cheap, and that's what the government's trying to do. Its own Committee on Climate Change says that we need to be investing 1% of GDP. By 2030, we need to be looking about 50 billion a year.
Well, the
very
Committee on Climate
least-
Change praised the government's net zero strategy and said that it was a huge step forward, one of the best of its kind anywhere in the world.
The net zero strategy is not worth the paper it's written on if it's not backed up by investment. You cannot do it on the cheap, and at the moment, that's what the Chancellor is trying to do.
Let's move on. We're going to, in fact, you mentioned the menopause. Carolyn, you have been campaigning vociferously on this. Before we get to the substance of some of the changes you would like to see in your proposal and your bill, tell us about your own experience.
Well, I've been taking antidepressants now for 11 years because in 2010, after a gynecological operation, I thought I was depressed and I was having a nervous breakdown. I didn't tell my doctor about all the other symptoms and I ended up on antidepressants, only to discover, having talking to other women over the last few years, that I was actually menopausal. And I'm finding that a lot of women are in the same position, that it's other women who are actually enlightening them to the fact that they are not losing their mind, they haven't got early onset dementia, they haven't got fibromyalgia, they're actually menopausal. So this whole campaign is about putting the menopause on the political agenda and making sure that everyone who is in a position to make the right changes takes that responsibility and does so.
And as you say, it can be life-changing and not in a good way for so many women. Were you surprised how little is talked about it?
Yeah, I mean, it was been terrifying. I mean, if you saw the emails I'm getting off women who were sharing their story with me, whilst I'm very honoured, I'm not a doctor, you know, and these people are not sharing those stories with the doctor because they're embarrassed, the doctor doesn't understand it, there's a complete lack of training within medical schools around the subject. It's 2021. Why are we only now talking about the menopause? But we've gained momentum, and whatever happens tomorrow, we have really put this subject on the top of the political agenda, and I know that we will do great things going forward.
What is happening tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow it's a private member's bill where I'm asking the government if they will make HRT free. The cost of HRT is prohibitory for women in England, but it was never the main focus. I wanted something that was going to raise attention of the issue, and that's what we've done. So tomorrow I think will be an interesting day because we will see people talking about their experiences. We will hear stories of how there are huge lacks in all aspects of life. Employment, personal relationships. You know, tomorrow we will see this revolution go to another level.
Right. I mean, Anita, listening to this, do you think there's enough done by businesses, bearing in mind, obviously, they all employ millions of women?
Yeah, I would say that businesses are a reflection of society in this regard, in that I don't feel I know a huge amount about the menopause and how, the workforce will be affected by the fact that 50% of people in the workforce go through this. And so I think there's a broader, and the reason why I commend Carolyn so highly is that there is a broader need to educate people, including women, about what it might mean. And I think that lack of knowledge and understanding is partly why we perhaps haven't seen businesses cater to women going through the menopause.
Right. Should hormone replacement therapy be free?
Well, I don't...
Is that a question for me?
No, I'm so sorry. Of course, I always forget, Anita, you can't see which way I'm looking, and I was looking at Robert.
I don't know is the honest answer. I mean, Carolyn has looked into this in more detail than I have. I think from reading between the lines, she's had quite a positive response from the government, but we'll see what the Minister has to say tomorrow. I mean, like Anita, I think it's great what Carolyn has achieved here, because it feels extraordinary to me that an issue that affects millions of women and has done since time immemorial has received so little debate in Parliament. And that may be a reflection of the fact that there's just been too few women in Parliament, but presumably it's also a fact that men are not educated enough in the topic or consider it a bit of a taboo subject that they feel uncomfortable talking about due to lack of understanding and knowledge. And if Carolyn's debate can help to change that, which I think it will do, then we'll be moving this issue forward very significantly.
Right, but have ministers been listening to you when it comes to exempting HRT from prescription charges?
I've been having very positive conversations with the government, and I'm confident that tomorrow we'll see a move forward to making sure that the whole environment around how we regard the menopause will be in a better place.
Right, but would you like those HRT to be exempt from prescription charges, Robert?
I don't know what the cost of that is. I'm sounding like a former Treasury Minister here, aren't I? It sounds like a very sensible thing to do. So, I mean, all power to Carolyn and her lobbying tomorrow.
How transformative do you think this will be then, Miatta?
I think, by the way, it should be free. I think that's a no-brainer. I think the campaign's fantastic. I don't think people talk about it enough. I think there are lots of women, I'm on my way there and I don't know that much about it and no one talks about it. So I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic and a massive thank you.
What about the cost, though, Carolyn?
The cost will be, in some part, a little bit... It's less to do with the cost.
Well, what are the costs now? But what are the costs?
Well, there isn't a cost. It's what the government will not get in.
Right.
Because it's the prescription charges. And a lot of that will be tied up in contracts which may be difficult to immediately remove themselves from. But I'm confident that tomorrow we will see a progression on the whole issue, not just on the HRT. And that was the whole point of this campaign, was to put the spotlight on the issue so that we are talking about it. I mean, I said vaginal dryness in the chamber twice last week.
Well, that'll be the first time on Politics Live, or the second time on Politics Live. Do you think we do need to be a bit more frank, Anita, about these sorts of issues, and not, as Robert said, be embarrassed about talking about them, whether in Parliament or on television?
Completely. And I think that there's two elements to this. I mean, there's obviously things like prescriptions and what you can do. But I think the key issue is how do we build a lot of trust between women and their GPs and other medical professionals that mean that there is more communication when such things arise. And we know from some of the research that came out over the past 2 years about the ways in which ethnic minority women, for instance, seem to receive poorer health outcomes, have less of a trusting relationship, receive, in some cases, poorer care, particularly around kind of things like childbirth and pregnancy. And we do need to rebuild that communication, not just across society, but between people and the medical profession to really be able to tackle some of these issues that particularly affect women.
Right, but talking about these issues in the way that Anita has said and listed some of the other difficult issues, particularly for women, what will actually change, though? Talking about them is one thing and airing these issues, but what will actually change and improve?
Well, we've already seen a huge change. We've seen companies who previously hadn't thought about this are now actually making provision for women in the workplace. We've had acknowledgement from some of the Royal Colleges that maybe there is a lack in knowledge of the doctors and nurses. But women, what's really important about this is, and this is a funny story but a true one, when my mother was talking to her sisters about one of their menopause, they sent me out of the room because it was too sensitive for my ears. I was 36, Jo.
Right.
So if at that age...
Not that young and...
No, exactly. But this is what we've done. We've not spoke about it. So we've lived our lives not really understanding what the menopause has done to us. It's only when you join up the dots that a lot of the conditions that women are suffering today are not actually fibromyalgia, early onset dementia. They're all menopausal. We need someone to join up the dots, and that means better understanding from us and better training for GPs and nurses.
And during your research and all the people you have talked to, did you ever discover a reluctance from some women over HRT and overtaking it?
That's changing. The narrative is changing on that. Women, I mean, I've not met a professional woman at the moment who's at that age who's not on HRT, because this is what making them be able actually to survive in the workplace. I think more and more women are coming to HRT, but there's still a little bit of myth that we need to bust. But this is what the debate is about, is making sure that women have the choice to have HRT if they so and they can take it.
We haven't got very long. What provision do you think employers should make, Miatta?
Well, I mean, I think the same way as we have employment policies and practices that cater for example, mental health provision or other health conditions, we need to do something similar for menopause. At the moment, if you're going through the menopause, everyone just assumes you'll get on with it. But actually, we need to be far more sensitive to that. And that can be done in employment policies very easily. All
right, well, that's all happening tomorrow. Carolyn, thank you for taking us through it. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. And we'll be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.